Hello, thank you for joining us for today's episode. Today's episode is pre-recorded. We're basically pre-recording some of the episodes due to some traveling, etc. So we're trying to still stick to the weekly schedule. We won't always manage, but we'll try our best to do that. For today's discussion, it will be quite varied. I have someone who's an open source enthusiast. He's been involved a lot in the WordPress community. He's contributed a lot as well. And I'd like to welcome Chris. Hello, Chris. How are you?
How's it going, Robert? I'm doing well.
Good. I'm good. Thanks for joining in. It's
Yeah,
nice. It's nice to have you. Yeah. Before we jump in, would you mind giving us a short introduction of who you are and how you've been involved in WordPress?
sure. Well, my name is Chris. I have been involved in WordPress for, I don't know, probably over 20 years now. I started out just using it for myself as a sort of a personal blog thing, and then I started actually getting into the guts of it. Probably pretty quickly after first downloading it. I like to tinker, and I remember the first theme that I downloaded had like different backgrounds or something. Like you could like the user could like choose a background for the site, and I thought that was really cool. But I wanted my own backgrounds that were different than the backgrounds of the theme. So then I started hacking the theme. Um, eventually,
Sorry.
event, eventually I started freelancing, and that led to working for Event Espresso, which is a event management plugin. That led to doing online developer training for Pluralsight, and ultimately that led to me working at Web Dev Studios and then Human Made, and then about 4.5 years ago, I left Human Made and I joined Pantheon as an engineer. And then about a year and a half ago, I became a senior developer advocate. So I'm working on the developer relations team.
Wow, quite an interesting journey from playing with teams, plugin devs, developer with agency, working in hosting.
I've
How's,
kind of done all the things you can do with WordPress.
no, and now, yeah, the last few months you've been involved as well in the WP Community Collective, right?
Hmm.
For those who don't know, because even I, to be honest, I've heard the name before and I've only read about it. I think after CloudFest, someone mentioned it, so I was reading. What is the WP Community Collective exactly?
Well, the idea behind the WP Community Collective is a couple things, but primarily one of the things that we're focused on is actually allowing committers to get paid for the work that they do to commit to WordPress core. So many there's a lot of large companies that sponsor contributions. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's like you are a core committer, but you're sort of like isolated and you're just like, well, we're going to pay you and put you on payroll, but you're just kind of sitting over there and not really interacting with the team. Other times it might be like, no, we actually want you to be committing, but we want you to be committing with a very particular like goal or idea, something that benefits the company that's sponsoring you. The idea with the WP Community Collective is we work with we take sponsored donations whatever from these organizations. So like obviously, so the biggest one is a year ago we got our first sort of big sponsorship from GoDaddy. And so what that means is that GoDaddy, if they wanted to, or any host could say, "Hey, we want you to start a fellowship, or we're interested in this sort of thing." They could put their name on a particular part of sponsored contribution. However, it doesn't have to work that way. We are a membership uh, based organization, so we have a couple fellowships that we are coming up with on our own that will that'll be sponsored, they'll be open to the community to have contributors, and to apply, and then we can pick whoever has, whoever fits the best, and then they would be sponsored by the WP Community Collective to do work in that particular area. So we do have sort of three different models. We have fellowships, projects, which are sort of like short-term. Fellowships can kind of be ongoing. So it takes a lot of the inspiration from like other sort of nonprofit models, which we don't really see so much in open source or in WordPress. But that's sort of like fellowships and projects and things are things that you see in the wider nonprofit sector. Projects are like sort of time constrained, like go dig deep on this thing and then come out the other side and tell us and how you like what the thing was. And then individual, like we did a campaign last year where we uh, gave money to the folks that were sponsoring table or doing table lead stuff, particularly those that were not being sent to WordCamps to be table leads on Contributor Day by their employer. So like you're otherwise you're like if I go I'd be paid for by Pantheon, so like I'm not necessarily in need my ticket and everything, but other people that are going on their own dime, we want to make sure that they are feeling welcome, that they have that it's sustainable, because it's really all about sustainability and making sure that this thing that we call WordPress is kept going and also kept sort of independent, because that's a thing that we don't necessarily see very often, particularly like when you think about like so many, like there's been so much discussion about like um, core contributors like coming predominantly from certain companies. Even and you see this even in Drupal too. Like Drupal development has tons and tons of the core development coming from Acquia employees. Acquia is Dries' company. It's the same thing is true for WordPress. There's a lot of contributors coming from Automatic. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that it does tends to skew towards things that would, either consciously or unconsciously benefit Matt's company, because that is where the committers are coming from. So the idea is that we want to have an alternative model for contribution to WordPress, and to the WordPress community that is sustainable and independent and not guided by any particular organization's objectives.
Interesting. I don't think people appreciate or know, because like yeah, if you look at WordPress, it's a very big project. And the reality is it's complicated, especially it's a remote. Everyone is working remote, of course. It's open source. What does it actually take to sustain like something like WordPress? Like in terms of numbers of developers, in terms of hours, how does the whole like process work? If there's an next release plan, for example.
Yeah, I mean it's there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, like there's so many different teams within WordPress. There's so many different pieces of WordPress, and there's so many different like mechanisms for planning and collaborating, and it becomes kind of a big sprawl. And I think really even breaking into the role of being a committer, or a contributor can be really difficult and daunting, because there's just so much stuff going on. There's a million different make blogs for individual teams that are doing development in any particular area. There's so many different things, and then even within those, it's hard to know like how to get a foot in the door. I was recently also named to be a team lead for the hosting team, and honestly, that was just like kind of by accident, because I was showing up, and then the team rep nominations came around, and I happened to be nominated, and they asked me, do you accept the nomination? I'm like, sure, this seems good, um, because that's a thing where like, as a representative of a host, we have a vested interest in how WordPress runs on Pantheon and how WordPress runs on other platforms. Um, and there have been times when there are features that are coming out of, the core channel, or, whatever, that may not work well on our platform or on other platforms. And so if we don't say those things and like raise a flag early, then that stuff is going to get shipped, and then things are going to ship broken for those particular situations. So um, it seems scary, but I think that like just I mean the secret of getting involved in WordPress core development is really just showing up in the Slack. I think is the big thing.
I was going to say, in fact, for those who are new, I would like to comment. What's the journey like, kind of to become, yeah, from you just join Slack and then become, as you said, like maybe a lead for a section of the project.
Yeah, I mean, I say that too, and I fully understand that, like, and empathize with the fact that it's also not always that easy. Like, I spend a lot of time, a long time before we moved to Slack when we were back on IRC. doing things with the documentation team. The documentation team is pretty welcoming. It's pretty easy to contribute. But when we tried to do other things, there was a feature plugin. It was back in the day when we were doing feature plugins. We wanted to make it more obvious or make it more visible to have sort of like in dashboard help stuff. And so the way that we imagined that happening was making better use of the help tab that's in the WordPress admin, which a lot of people don't even know exists. So the first question is, can people find the help tab when it exists on a page? And we did all sorts of user testing, and most people didn't even see it. We like user testing, you paid for people to spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes doing a couple different tasks, like write a blog post, go to make a page, whatever. But specifically places where there would be the help tab for them to like read and figure out how to do the thing that they're trying to do. And most people didn't. uh, and so then it was like, okay, how can we make this more obvious? Do we want to make it a different color? Do we want to and so we did all this user research. We made a feature plugin, and then promptly the feature plugin was dismissed when it was being reviewed by sort of the core team. And that was really frustrating and really disappointing. Like we put all this work into this thing, and then it was just like, yeah, no, this doesn't seem like a good thing to do. And like rather than like saying, hey, this isn't the implementation that we would like, but we like the idea and we like the thought that went into it. It was just like, no, we're not going to do this. So like it can be really frustrating too, to sort of break in the door, especially when you don't kind of know people, like know what the status, like know a core, like have a buddy, have somebody who works. And I think that it's getting better. I think that like again going to like contributor day and like going to like a committers table or like a team table and just like figuring out how you can contribute is a good thing. And sometimes those things are online. But breaking in is and actually contributing can be daunting because it's just there's not an easy guide, an easy onboarding.
Yes, it's been a while. I've been to a few contributors day. I haven't been in the last few years, but it's pre-corona. I've been to a few, and it's true. I've been in the WordPress ecosystem for quite a few years now, but it's true. Like trying to contribute and stuff, especially if you are new to contribution days, yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming because you walk into this room, hundreds of people
Mm-hmm.
is at the table, and it's kind of, it's not just that there is no guide. It's no one's fault, but it's kind of like you're expected to know some basics, what you should do, and you have to ask around, there's no, like some sort of something for newbies or newcomers and stuff. So it's a bit, it can be a bit overwhelming, no?
Yeah, and I went to DrupalCon a year ago, not this last one, but one a year ago. And so they have a community summit. They have summits for DrupalCon. They have summits on the first day, and then they have their talks and whatever. And then at the end of DrupalCon is when they do contributor day. So the summits are often like an upsell. Like there's like the government summit, a higher ed summit, sort of like enterprise sort of things. But then they have the community summit, which everyone is welcome to. And the community summit was really good for me to understand how the Drupal community even works, like how the Drupal association works, how Drupal contribution works, how the community like works within itself, how the teams work with each other, and how projects get decided which things go into core and which things don't. And so that was really cool. And then at the end of it, after the whole the several days of talks and after the community summit, everything, they have contributor day. And the way that they did their contributor day is if you already knew how to contribute, then you could just go to whatever room or table or whatever and do the things, right? If you didn't, you had a mentor. And the mentor would literally like find a low-hanging ticket and say, let's work on this thing, and guide you through the entire process from like finding the thing, making the change, committing the change, pushing it up to the Drupal GitLab instance, and then like flagging it in Slack, and then like front to back, like let's get one thing done. And I think that's a really valuable model because that like it makes it easy. You have a buddy the whole time, you have a guide, and so if you run into things, then you have somebody sitting with you the whole way through that knows the process a little better than you. And I don't think it like there wasn't that many. There was a lot of, contributors there, but it was like really just somebody who had done this a couple times before. It wasn't even necessarily like one of the leads or anything on the project. It was just someone who knew how to do this. And more people end up knowing how to do the thing when you train people up like this, right? So like it doesn't have to take that many iterations for you to then, turn around and become a mentor yourself because you've already done the thing a couple times with other people.
That's interesting. I know there are mentors for WordCamps, organizing WordCamps. There are now
Yeah.
mentors, of course, with the WordPress education program that there is, but
Yep.
it would be nice to have something for contributors. I know you just mentioned that you went to a Drupal conference, and in one of your posts, in fact, you said something like WordPress is not and cannot be kind of like Drupal. Well, like what are the major differences you've seen? Because it's very good. One thing I've noticed, especially from CloudFest, which is not CloudFest is not a WordPress specific, it's a hosting, but they're a bit of everything. And clearly, I've heard a few people talking about this. There's a lot to learn, not just from WordPress, but it works both ways. Open source communities can learn a lot from each other. So,
Yeah.
what stood out from the Drupal conference that you think maybe we can learn from in WordPress or bring along?
There's a couple things that I think WordPress can learn from Drupal. I'll go with well, there's a couple things I think that are different that I would like to see in WordPress, and I don't know if either of these things would actually end up happening. But one of the things that I observed that was really striking to me about the Drupal community, and I think that we talked about this on the episode of my podcast that we talked where we talked, which I think will probably air after this one. But it's the idea that like if in Drupal, everyone is there isn't as much money to be made in Drupal, which is a good thing and a bad thing. In WordPress, there's this commercial ecosystem for plugins and themes and everything, and it's good for business, but it's less good for collaboration. Because if I have an SEO plugin and you have an SEO plugin, then I'm less inclined to want to share my ideas with you unless I'm bringing you into mine or you're bringing me into yours or whatever to combine those thoughts, those ideas, because that's kind of our intellectual property, right? Like that's the thing that I'm going to potentially like make money on. In Drupal, if I have an SEO plugin and you have an SEO plugin, and yours is bigger or more established or whatever, and I have some interesting new ideas, you might call me over and say, hey, can we pull this into this SEO plugin to make it a better SEO plugin? And you see this in like recipes, which is a concept that Drupal 11, I think, introduced, where it's sort of like a collection of different modules and configurations for different things. And so there's an SEO recipe that pulls in a bunch of different modules and things for individual things, individual aspects, and configures them so that a user doesn't have to do all of that work themselves. And those are like those are basically trying to find the best solution for the user. But obviously, if you're doing that, then you can't sell the thing because it becomes harder, it becomes a bigger organization, and because it's open, you're giving it, but it creates this sort of sense of community. It creates like this sense of sharing ideas and collaboration between agencies, between people that are otherwise competing with each other, that you see less in the WordPress space. Like I think that like I just came back from PressConf, and there's a room full of different hosts, and we're all competing with each other. But also we're there in the same room, we're having conversations, we're hanging out. Like we're competing, but we're also collaborating. But it's still like when it comes to businessy stuff, like we're still competing with each other, right?
Yeah.
And trying to get everybody else's business because that's the way capitalism works. So I really liked the vibe of that sort of just sense of community, that sense of collaboration, just as a default. But again, I don't think that can really work with the way that the commercial ecosystem works in WordPress. So it's sort of like a good thing and a bad thing. And the other thing that I observed from Drupal is just the way governance and how decisions are made about the project itself come about. So first of all, And this is all stuff that I learned from being there is that Drupal cons cost a lot of money to go. They're like $800 or something to get
Oh,
a
okay.
ticket to DrupalCon, which is not like a ton of money when you think about like tech conferences in general, but definitely a lot of money when you compare it to a $50 ticket to WordCamp, right? Um, and the reason why, well, one of the things that they do with that money is it goes back into the Drupal Association. The Drupal Association then takes that money, they use it to for the next DrupalCon, of course, because they do the organization, or they actually hire a event management team to do the organization, which is shocking in the WordPress space. Um, but they use that money to fund projects, and so to fund the projects, they need to figure out what projects are important to fund. So there's a board. They come to a conclusion. Dries has a seat on the board because he's the founder of Drupal, but he's not the only voice on the board. And the people are voted in. The board members are actually paid positions. They pay people to manage the website. They pay people to do the event management. I mean, it's like they use this money that they're raising from DrupalCons and Drupal events to fund the actual development. And then when a project is selected, they go out and find an agency or a couple different agencies to work on that thing, and they put some of that money into funding this particular thing. So like, a couple years ago, they wanted to get into AI and figure out how AI could integrate with Drupal, and so that became a project within Drupal, and the Drupal Association was able to, sponsor development of that thing. That's kind of sort of what the WPCC, kind of going back to that's kind of sort of the model that we would like to kind of do, is, have projects, have fellowships, have a means of fundings, development, that is, you know, from the community, figure out what the community wants, which in our case means what do the community members, what do the members of the WP Community Collective want to see. Obviously, we on the board have ideas, but like other people, we want to take their input as well. And then we put it out to the community and say, okay, do you think that this is a good thing to sponsor? And so they can vote on those things. And then ultimately, hopefully we get somebody to do that work, and then we can say, hey, look at what we did, and look at what we kind of put into play. And that's a thing where so that's one of the reasons actually, because I joined the WPCC not long after going to DrupalCon, because I kind of I had this model in my head because I had just seen it, and then Say and Courtney and Katie come along and say, hey, here's this thing in WordPress where we're taking ideas from other sort of open source communities, and we're trying to emphasize sustainability and contribution, and actually pay contributors for their labor. And I said, yeah, that seems like the thing. That seems like a good thing to do.
Interesting. Just being the devil's advocate here, like usually competition leads to more innovation. However, as you said, of course, when you're contributing together, the project itself will grow as well. So it's like, which one, like, because if you don't have competition, maybe there is not enough push, not enough pressure for someone to improve. Like, how do you see that working? Drupal versus WordPress, for example. Yeah.
I mean, I think that ultimately, like, the market determines what is needed, right? And so if you're making a bunch of sites, and most of the modules in the Drupal sort of ecosystem come out of like a need that, I mean, they come out of agencies, or they come out of individual developers that are working in the space, right? So if you like are seeing a thing like over and over that you're having to do for your clients, then you're going to probably make a module to make that easier, so that you're not having to like copy paste code all the time. And then that becomes something like, if that gets used a lot, then that becomes like rises to the top just sort of naturally. And then if you rise it to the top naturally, and there's something else that's very similar that could like integrate that in, and that, like, so like, not to say that like, uh, you know, Drupal modules or WordPress plugins should be like kitchen sink and like, put everything interesting into it. But I do think that the idea of like, and a lot of like how modules are even built and structured are like, they're like an it's in WordPress, it's sort of like the idea of like an add-on to someone else's plugin. So like you might get Gravity Forms, and then you might download from WordPress.org a plugin that like hooks into Gravity Forms or hooks into
Yeah.
ACF or something. There's a lot more of that happens in Drupal, and part of that I think is because Drupal is fundamentally built on top of Composer. So essentially, a module is a Composer dependency, and so if I'm building something that builds on top of something else, like a search plugin, then a dependency for my module that is a search related thing is going to be the main search, the core search. And then Pantheon has a search API Pantheon, which is hooks into search API. So maybe my module is hooking into search API Pantheon. So my dependency would be search API Pantheon. And so I'm already pulling these things in. So for my thing, and that's just sort of like how the architecture is kind of built in Drupal. Which again is a thing that doesn't really exist in the same way in WordPress. In fact, we only just barely added, recently-ish, like plugin dependencies, which is sort of the same sort of idea.
Yeah.
But that it took a lot longer to come to that conclusion than it took Drupal, who's been doing it for many years.
So it seems like out of the box without plugins, the Drupal core is more featureful than WordPress. WordPress is more basic, more core, and then of course there are the plugins competing. But Drupal, because there's this idea of community, the core of course is kind of like has more built-in features, right? Is stronger kind of.
It's a lot more extensible out of the box, and it's a lot more configurable. That said, configuration there's a whole class of professionals that work in the Drupal space whose job it is just to configure Drupal.
Okay.
Like we don't have the idea of like a site manager sort of thing, or in WordPress really, because most things in the WordPress admin can be done by anyone. That's sort of the point. Whereas in Drupal, because it's like config files and really deep settings pages and things, like just configuring the site can be a job in and of itself beyond like the content editing and stuff. So that can get really complex and deep. So that's again, it's like it's a pro and a con, right? Like you trade off something that it makes it really easy and intuitive, but in the result is something that's really more complex and potentially more powerful.
Interesting. Now, of course, there's pros and cons to every model you choose, but yes, it's right. So going back to the WP Community Collective, so as a business, if we want to sponsor a core contributor, like does it as such make a difference? Would you recommend, like how would you sell should we do it via WP Community Collective, or we can do it directly? Like what are the pros and cons of going one or the other?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you want to get out of it. One of the things that we're hoping to help companies do is to sort of manage, like you can put if you sponsor if you want to sponsor a contributor through the WPCC, we let you put your name on whatever that sponsored contributor does, and you don't have to worry about like really like the paperwork, the payroll, the whatever. Like you don't have to hire them on as a contractor or as a full-time employee or whatever and deal with all of that, the logistical stuff. Like basically the idea is that we would be able to handle that for you, and then you could still put your name on because it was still your money that was going towards that contributor. So like, and then ultimately what that person does is, up to the collective and up to the project or the fellowship that they're, contributing toward. But yeah, so it's a lot of like, the idea is to take some of the pressure off of, having to have dedicated seats that you then need to justify to like your CFO or whatever to say like this is why these people are on payroll. Like you could do the same thing and you can contribute to WordPress core or the WordPress community without actually having to have them on that. I mean, you can do the other thing if you want to. Like that's people do, and that's great. And by all means, like we're not gonna say only use the WPCC to sponsor contribution. We're just trying to create a different sort of governance around it and a different sort of model that is, I think, unique to the WordPress community.
No, it's good. Yes, it makes sense. So as a sponsor, basically, if you sponsor someone, you will get your name on the project. However, it's not up to you to decide what's going to be done. As you said, there's the community who vote or have a say on where the funds are spent and which projects, right?
Yep. Yep.
Nice. Interesting. And what is your role at the WPCC?
I was named at the end of last year as the interim president of the WPCC, and part of the reason why I said interim was because we don't have we haven't written down what all the roles actually mean and do yet, and so I didn't want to be taking on the title of actual president until I knew what exactly a president did. So currently, what my job is, though, is to kind of wrangle the rest of the board. So making sure that everybody's talking to each other and that we're doing things and moving forward. I work a lot with the CEO say, and yeah, so it's, but like we are planning on having sort of brainstorming and work sessions to define the roles more specifically, and then at some point we'll drop the interim and I will just be president of the WPCC.
Nice. If someone wants to help and wants to get involved in the WPCC, like where should they start and what type of commitments is actually expected, kind of thing?
If you want to get involved, you can go to the website. There's information. It's the WP Community Collective .org or .com, one of those. I think it's .org. Might be .com. But it's the WP Community Collective. And we'll make sure that it's in the show notes. Yeah, just become a member. Currently, there's a membership due that's $5 a year, and that goes towards the group. Again, members might decide that the membership dues will change, but for now it's $5, and that's the way it is. And it's again $5 a year, so it's not like a monthly subscription. And that goes towards just sustaining the organization. But also, once you're a member, then you get access to Slack channel. You get access to there's a GitHub repository where like we vote on proposals and projects and things, and everything is open to the member community to vote on for whenever anything sort of comes up. You can join. We have quarterly board meetings that everybody is open to join to talk about what the board has been doing this last quarter and go over any finances. And yeah, so once you're in, you're kind of in, and then you can, there's other fellow community members that you can sort of like, yeah, just it's its own sort of Slack community. But really, like the big thing that you get is being able to can vote on anything that is coming out of the WPCC. And then I'll also, like, if you're really interested, we'd love to talk to you. Like we're trying, like our board is pretty small at the moment, but we do have plans on expanding the board a little bit more in the future. And so, like, if you're really passionate, then we would love to hear from you.
Nice, interesting. So basically, yeah, if you pay $5 a year, which is nothing quite, but yeah, you get the right to vote and contribute a bit more. For companies, agencies, businesses listening to this who would like to contribute back to WordPress, of course, beyond sponsoring a World Cup, what are typically the best way to contribute to the community and to WordPress in general?
Besides sponsorship, I mean, I think that getting involved in, like, getting into the core Slack and like figuring out what makes sense for whatever your team or your agency. There's always new stuff coming out, and there's always new teams. Again, like I said, like I joined the hosting team because I happen to work for a host, and it seemed like an important thing for me to be aware of what's going on in the hosting channel. And in the past, I've been involved in the documentation team. Just recently for WordPress 7, there was a channel dedicated to the real-time collaboration feature, and I know there's a lot of like people from agencies that are contributing to that as well. And I think it's really just like there's so many different things to be involved in that it's like what makes sense for you or your agency, and then find that thing and then just start start like following the Slacks. Usually, like so, like the hosting team, for example, like we have a meeting every week at a regular time. It's in the make/hosting P2, and most of the actual dedicated teams have regular meetings, and the meeting times are posted in the make.wordpress.org P2 for that team. So that's a really easy way of even if you're just following along, even if you're just like or joining, like reading the back scroll after it's done, like because it's sort of designed to be like it's in Slack, so it can be kind of asynchronous, so you can go back and then make comments later. You can get involved that way, and I think that's a really good way of like just learning about what's going on, and then making comments. Like a story that I like to tell is that a couple versions ago, when we were talking about adding the font manager to WordPress core, I found an issue where the font manager would basically be useless or not function properly on Pantheon because of our read-only file system on our platform. So like anyone and any other host, not just Pantheon, but there's other hosts that have a read-only file system for security and various other reasons. Um, and yeah, the font manager just wouldn't work at all after you get your because you have to commit those files to the repository, and then if you did, it would committing the files is because there's a database reference for fonts, and there's also the actual font file itself. So you could commit the files and push it up to your production site, but then it wouldn't necessarily be in the database unless you like plucked out the database entries and put it over here in your production database, which is silly. Um, and so like I was like, look, all I want is a filter or a constant or something that says my font files live here in a writable folder. And that hadn't been built in, and it took time for them to build it. So they punted it into a later version of WordPress, and then when they did, it had been like all these things had been built into it. So, and that was just me raising a hand, being like, "Hey, y'all, this is going to break." For us and anyone that has an architecture like this, and that forced the feature to be delayed so that it could be built and more and thought through a little bit more. So it doesn't take much. I got a contributor credit for saying
Right.
don't do this thing, which is hilarious. And then also like I was also commenting on like the GitHub issues and the Gutenberg project because that's I think the repository where this was happening, which just seems like weird, but everything is Gutenberg, I guess. So whatever. Um, but yeah, so like it doesn't take that much to get involved. Even if what you're doing is like, hey, pump the brakes a little bit.
Interesting. Um, uh, I've heard this before. Like I've heard the quote like open source doesn't pay my rent. So like what for agencies and developers, I've contributed in the past, and there's a lot of it's not just about money. There's much more ROI. But yeah, for if to sell contributing to agencies and developers and companies, what do you get back from contributing?
I mean, I think that the phrase or the thought open source isn't paying my rent uh, is probably built on a false premise. Because if what is paying your rent is building WordPress sites, then open source is absolutely paying your rent. So there's, I know Matt has made comments, and obviously, honestly, Dries has made similar comments, and lots of people in open source, honestly, have made comments about how um, there are people that like try to extract value from open source, which is to say they're using open source and they're capitalizing off of open source software and they're not giving anything back. And I don't necessarily feel like I think that there's ways of giving things back that are less tangible than like core contributions or money or whatever. Because I think there's something to be said about like using the project and sharing the project with others and getting other people involved, and also like proving that it can run in this type of environment or that type of environment or for this type of site or that type of site. And those things benefit the ecosystem too, and don't have any sort of like monetary or like tangible value necessarily. But I will say that like the reason why things like the WPCC and the Drupal Association exist is because um, you know it is at the end of the day, we do need to pay someone. There's infrastructure costs. There's like the cost of running things, like and then there's the cost of the time cost for contributors to who are doing the actual work, who aren't getting compensated otherwise. Like it's still labor, and somebody is doing the labor somewhere, right? And if you're benefiting from open source, if your bottom line is coming from software that you build on top of open source software, then it's I you know it seems like a good idea. Like, I'm not going to get into morals or like imperatives or whatever, but like it
Of
seems
course.
like a good idea to give back to the people that are helping build the things that you're using. I had a conversation on my podcast with Juliet Rainers Fulmer, who is the maintainer of PHP and other, which is the PHP code sniffer. Um, and she and other things as well. And she said that at the end of her, like, she's a freelancer, and she uses a lot of open source software. And at the end of the year, like every year, she like sets aside a percentage of what she made that year to give to donate back to all of the tools that she used over the course of the year. So she just puts away a set percentage, and then at the end of the year, she evaluates all of the projects that she used, and then divides what that percentage of her revenue was to those different projects, and she just does it every year. So every December, she's like going through and seeing what she used, and like not everybody has to do something like that, but like something like that seems like a good idea. Like that's a sustainable way of making sure that the stuff you're using and you're benefiting from and arguably profiting from are able to continue sustainably, because uh, you're otherwise, like so many projects. I mean, even B2, right? Like the whole story of WordPress is founded on this idea of there's an open source project that the maintainer walked away from for whatever reason, and then Matt and Mike Little jumped in and took it to where it is today. And I've seen that too, and part of the reason why people walk away from open source projects is because they're not getting paid for them. Like
Yeah.
how different would this have been if the founder of B2 Cafe Log had been sponsored to build the thing that he built? Like, would we be all using B2s? I don't.
Yeah, no, no, I agree 100%. And to be honest, like even as a business, because we do something similar to what you said, like the PHPCS story that you mentioned, we do the same. In fact, at the end of the year, there are still plugins which we use, which are completely free, and they have the donate button and stuff like that. We do donate, and it makes a difference because I've received some really touching emails, and some like it's nice to see people happy for your contributions. And at the end of the day, even if you want to look at it from the business point of view, if you are contributing, let's say you sell WordPress plugins, if you are contributing to WordPress, the ROI is that you're helping develop WordPress to reach more people, and at the end of the day, to sell more as a business. So there is actually, when you look at it, even from the financial point of view, yeah, as you said, open source is paying for your rent because you contribute to WordPress. WordPress will grow, so the potential for your business to sell more
Yeah,
is
I
there
mean,
as well.
in business, there's like cost of goods and services, right? And we don't think
Yes.
of WordPress because it is open source that it is a good or service that has a cost, but it does because it costs people to build this thing, right? And so like it whether that people cost is tangible or financially, like you can touch it, you can like put a value on it, or not, like it still means that there's actual labor that's going into this, and there's actual cost involved in making sure that it's sustainable.
Yeah, and you don't need to do a lot, quite frankly, because even if you do the most basic, if you go to a WordCamp, for example, and it's very normal, someone has a problem, someone is new to WordPress, and you just help them. You're the kind of, I wouldn't say contributing, but yeah, you are directly helping a person with using WordPress, which is somehow contributing to the whole community, etc. So you don't need to, like, it doesn't always have to be something tangible, as you said,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you could. Nice. Yeah, jumping a bit into WordPress, the technology. You've worked on enterprise territory, basically with human made. What, just curious, what's the difference between an enterprise website versus like what is just another website? Like what really differs between those type of websites?
I think that the biggest difference is like everything matters 1,000 times more, right? Like my personal blog, I don't care if my database is like has old tables in there from old plugins that I'm not using anymore. I don't care that much because I know that like eh, maybe 100 people see my website in a month. It doesn't matter. If 1,000 or 1,000,000 people are hitting your website every day, those things matter a lot more. So things that an individual wouldn't care about just matter a lot more. Things like, how's your site being cached? How many layers of caching do you have? How it optimizes your database table? How optimized are your WordPress queries? Like all of these things matter so much more, and like a tiny little change can make like a huge difference because you're not talking about a scale of like a couple hundred people visiting your site over a month. You're talking about, potentially 1,000,000 people hitting your site, in a day. And I've seen stuff like that because I've worked on big projects that like have like sudden spikes in traffic. Like one of the projects that I worked on was for PlayStation. Obviously, PlayStation has every couple years a really big announcement, right, with a new system coming out, and the website needs to not explode, and so the things you need to do to prevent your website from exploding involve like you need to upscale the server environment. You need to make sure that your caching is really good. You need to make sure that your database queries are really good so that you're not creating an experience where like a bunch of people are going to hit the site at the same time and then it just overwhelms everything and you get a white screen of death and like, nothing works. Because for a company like Sony, that matters a lot. Same thing with any other sort of enterprise business. So I think that it's really like it's not hard. It's just a bunch of rules really, and it's a bunch of like additional checks to make sure that the things that you're doing are sort of like best practices and standardized. And so like to build those sites, again, like if I'm doing a site for myself, I'm probably the only one working on the code. The teams that work on sites of that scale are going to have several layers of review. They're going to have, there's going to be like a senior engineer that has seen this stuff. There's going to be a bunch of other engineers that are working on the code, and everybody's reviewing everyone else's code. There's going to be levels of like audits and review and like accessibility and like all sorts of things. So just more involved in making sure that it is the site that is the best possible platform for whatever the enterprise company is. But yeah, so it's just more. It's just bigger,
Yeah.
and it can be a little bit terrifying because you're talking about like the scale is so different. But it's honestly like it's just a bunch of rules that you need to learn as you go, and then you have a site, and yeah, it's it's really, yeah, it's really more about the scale.
So basically, I would say like a normal business would want a website and to build it for them. However, an enterprise would come with a bunch of requirements. It needs we would have this amount of users. We definitely cannot afford this amount of downtime, this speed, etc. So we have more requirements basically.
Yeah.
And
Like on Pantheon, for example, like okay, we have a couple layers of caching. Obviously, you can cache things in the browser. Like a lot of browsers will cache things locally. Then there's object cache or Redis caching, which is server side PHP caching. So Pantheon has that, supports that. And then in addition to that, there is like CDN layer caching, which Pantheon also supports. A lot of other providers also do that, or they're third-party providers like Fastly and Cloudflare and things like that. So that when you actually are making the request for the site, you're not even getting to the server, you're getting to the cloud server first that has a full page, full cached version of that page already. And the idea is like ideally you never hit the site at all, right? You're only ever hitting a cached version of that site, and you're never and if you do hit the site, well, maybe you're hitting a cached version of that site, so the server doesn't need to do any sort of technical operations to think about your request. And then worst case scenario, it does hit the database, it is doing some processing, and you've optimized your database queries to such a degree that it's not having to think very hard. And then when it does, all of those things then perpetuate the new cached version of that site, of that page, right? So that's sort of the ideal architecture diagram. And in WordPress, especially since I moved into Pantheon and we have like the CDN layer, the thing that was the hardest thing for me to sort of conceptualize, because I'm used to like object cache and like server side caching, but I'd never worked in an environment where the CDN was given to everyone and also like so fundamentally important to how the site operates. And but like the difference is extraordinary, right? Because like also like along with like when you have a CDN, like usually there's a bunch of different nodes all over the place. It's also point of presence, so that you're hitting the closest server to you. So again, you're saving time on the request because you're hitting, like I might be hitting a server in Denver as opposed to a server in like New York if I'm in Salt Lake City. And that makes, milliseconds or microseconds of change. But again, on scale, it makes a really big difference. And those are the sorts of things that matter for an enterprise, especially given that like Google and other search engines prioritize speed and how quickly the site renders. And honestly, like if your site is slow to render, then or think parts of your site are slow to render, then your users are going to walk away anyway. Like they're not going to want to wait for that to load either.
And so you mentioned a lot of things, like edge caching, the server caching, hosting itself, database queries, etc. So of course, when building an enterprise website, there are much more people involved. How do workflows, deployments and team coordination change, as these type of complexity increase?
Well, again, to go back to sort of Pantheon's workflow, we have a very specific workflow where you have a dev environment, a test environment, and a live environment, and everything goes up the chain that way, like goes from dev to test to live. You can't sort of like circumvent the test environment, go straight to live. And the idea there is that like all of your development work goes into the dev environment. You can test it and you can look at it and whatever, and then you push it up to test, and test is like the last thing before it goes live. So you can do your user accessibility or user acceptance testing on the test environment to make sure that everything looks good before actually pushing it live. And then also we have the concept of multi-devs where like if I have a feature branch that I'm working on, that can have its own separate dedicated environment as well. And then I can merge that into dev when it's done, but it has its own environment that I can view and see and test and like break before it gets pushed into the chain. When I've worked in other agencies, it's very similar sort of workflow. One thing that you'll find often in agency work is that in the absence of having a dedicated sort of, or having the capability of having like a multi-dev like Pantheon has, what you end up doing is you make the dev branch where all of your development work goes in to do all the testing, which means that your dev branch ends up getting really messy. And so you want to keep that separate from, your staging or your test environment and your production environment, right? Because it's getting a lot of like experimental code, and like backing it out and doing other things is really difficult and kind of can cause other problems. So the branching strategy is a little bit different, but the end result is that you still want to have like a dev sort of test bed, some sort of staging environment where you're making sure that this is like the last check before pushing to production, and then obviously also your production environment. And I think that's pretty standard for enterprise work.
Interesting. So that basically explains why usually enterprise projects take longer to complete, and also when there is a change needed. When you compare, startups are well known for being much more agile than enterprises. However, of course, as you've been saying, you have so many stages just to release something that there are much more guardrails. Enterprises are much slower at these things. However, typically there are much less places where to go wrong, or where something breaks, right? Is it that's why there are all these checks and balances?
I think guardrails is the right phrase. I think it's really about like making sure that that things don't go off the rails. Like you're having many different places where you're running tests, and you're making sure like testing in the environments that, or in a similar environment to what it's going to look like when it actually gets pushed to production, so that when it does get pushed to production, it's not being pushed with problems. And there's just a lot of stop gaps. But that doesn't necessarily mean that stuff has to be like distinctly slower. It just means there's steps involved, right? And a lot of times, I mean, it does often mean that things are slower, but that's also a product of the risk tolerance of the enterprise that we're working with, right? Like if there's a enterprise company that wants to move really fast, you can go dev test live, in one day if you really wanted to. And that's fine. But most of the time, I think that it's more like, yeah, let's be careful, let's be calculated, let's make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row and then let's plan for the deployment, which is another big sort of piece in a lot of sort of enterprise work, where like, yeah, we're going to deploy, but we're going to deploy on this day at this time so we can watch all the things and monitor all the, the new relic and everything to make sure that when it does go out, then it's going out smoothly. And then we have a rollback plan in case something goes awry. And that I think that that's also like, it's again because these sites are bigger, because they're there's millions of dollars that can be made or lost on like the site being available, that it matters a lot more to make sure that you get everything right.
Interesting. So when you have such websites, as you said, like British, it's a huge, massive website. I'm presuming both in terms of size, but also visits, etc. And you have this complex process to update something or read something. Just curious, like how do usually like plugin updates work in such scenarios?
That depends. A lot of times, so one of the things, like a reason why I really like Composer, is because if I'm a WordPress user and I have plugin updates on WordPress, then I can just hit a button in my WordPress admin and update all of my plugins, and that's fine for me. But if one of those plugins has a problem or it didn't update properly or something, there's some issue, I might end up with a white screen of death, right? There's some
Yeah.
error, there's some fatal error in one of those plugins, and I don't even necessarily know which plugin it was, right? Because I just hit update all. And then I'm stuck. And if I'm a user and not Chris Reynolds, the senior developer advocate, I might not know how to solve that problem, right? So one of the things that I really like about Composer, Composer is something that I learned and got really familiar with when I was working at Human Made, um, that puts the keys to all of those, like those dependency updates, those version updates, in the hands of the people that know how to fix them, right? So it's a piece of code, it's a JSON file that says this version of this plugin or this dependency, this package is now going from point 1 to point 2, and if that update broke something, then I've got a single text file that shows me what that change was, that just, the version number, and I can roll it back to a specific version very easily because it just installs the previous version. And then also I know how to fix it because I'm a developer and I'm the one that has access to managing those version updates. Um, and that's one thing that we used a lot. I mean, every site that we built at Human Made was built on top of Composer, which also managed not only like plugin updates but also WordPress core updates. And then the flip side of that is you're probably going to be a little bit slower about or I guess maybe not slower, but more methodical about your plugin updates when you're doing them. You're gonna definitely want to update things when there are security vulnerabilities, but those are going to be like minor like patch updates, and maybe not feature updates. And you might be slower on adopting the bigger feature updates, and just focus on the patch updates, and then do all of the sort of feature updates in one go or like in a branch or whatever, so that you can make sure all of those things like happen normally and don't break. But it's just going to be a little bit more methodical about like the process. And this is something that I think that like this kind of workflow, like again, Drupal's been doing this sort of thing for years, and they're very familiar with managing sites in this way. It's a little bit less familiar in the WordPress space, just because Composer is not a thing that
Yeah.
a lot of WordPress developers or agencies use. Like I do think a lot of agencies now are using Composer, but it's not something that is universal. And certainly users are just used to clicking the button in the admin and
Yeah.
getting their updates. And so like if you have a C-suite person that has a WordPress blog on the side, they're not gonna maybe necessarily understand that there's a whole other layer, and that they shouldn't be clicking the update button, because with their personal blog or their WordPress.com blog or whatever, well, I guess not on WordPress.com, but like their personal blog, they
WordPress,
just click a button and then it updates. And so why can't we do that for the the corporate site? Well, there's a reason why we can't do that for the corporate site. We don't want to blow up your corporate site. We want your corporate site to be safe and secure, and a little bit less prone to issues. And that's sort of a worst case example. Like, obviously, most plugins don't break your site when you hit update.
Yes, correct.
But it can happen. And also just even features, like if you're introducing new features and you built something around a plugin, and now this update changes how that works, you're going to need time to adapt your code to the new way that it works.
Yeah, in fact, that is why I think this new CRA compliance thing from the EU is quite good. It's good to separate security updates that would have specific. If you're releasing an update, if there's a security issue, release an update just for the security issue, and don't try to merge it in with some feature updates, because there's a big difference. In fact, like when there's something critical, because from this year's report from PatchTech, I was talking to Oliver at CloudFest and said, like, the window from when a patch is released and there's a mass exploitation is around 5 hours. So does security, especially in these, as you said, like you have to compose and like a complex setup, does security and urgency maybe change the process or the conversation? How is it when it's something urgent? For example, if someone's using a plugin or there's some core issue that needs to be handled ASAP.
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, that honestly, like, that's a really good argument for Oliver's company, with
of course,
the vulnerability patching thing, that, like, so you don't even have to push the code. PatchStack will, like, if you're on the paid plan or whatever, it'll patch it for you while you're fixing it up yourself. That buys you time. It's not a solution. It's not a long-term solution, but the whole reason why that exists is because, like, yeah, even between the time that you're informed that there's a vulnerability and the time that you ship code, it's already been exposed, and there's a chance that you could be made vulnerable to that security vulnerability. So that's why things like that exist. I think, yeah, I mean, there's definitely like a scramble to make sure that that the vulnerability gets patched, or you get the latest update. But like, from an enterprise side, like, they're not necessarily the ones that are doing the plugin development for their dependency. Like, if they're using someone else's plugin and the plugin is the thing that's vulnerable, they're not responsible for the code, so they're still waiting for that code. So it's then, in those cases, it is nice to have a sort of buffer or something in place so that, like, you're still safe while you're waiting for the fix, and then once the fix is available, then you can push up the update. There's all sorts of automation that can be run to make sure that things are getting updated on a regular basis. Like, if your code is managed in GitHub, then you can run Dependabot, and Dependabot will check for updates of your dependency packages. Of any kind, NPM, Composer, GitHub Actions, whatever, and will give you PRs. That runs on a schedule, so it's not necessarily going to be the most, the up to the minute sort of thing. But things like that, having automation in place to sort of manage that stuff for you in the background is always a good thing to have anyway. Just so that it's not like, okay, like, set off the fire alarm and, like, everybody scrambles to their desks and pushes the update.
Yeah, in fact, good point. Even PatchTech themselves say, like, PatchTech is definitely it's good, but it's not a permanent solution. It doesn't mean you shouldn't update your plugins, but at least it's giving you this window, this breathing space, a bit of breathing space where you can, you're secure until you test your things and go to the process, etc.
Yep.
I have many more questions, even about hosting and stuff, but time is running out. Thanks a lot for sharing information, Chris. Before we end this episode, by the way, the WP Community Collective website is .com. We'll add it to the show notes. Before we end this episode, is there anything you'd like to mention, or we missed, or we forgot?
Well, I mean, I'm Jazz Sequence on the internet. Sometimes Jazz Sequence with a 3, sometimes without a 3. My website is jazzsequence.com. Actually, if you go to next.jazzsequence.com, you'll see a brand new version of my website that I recently rebuilt using Claude Code, and I'm really excited about that. And I've been trying to blog a little bit more. I've been doing lots of stuff with AI. And yeah, there's links around. And yeah, I'm around on Blue Sky and LinkedIn and other places like that.
Good. In fact, this was going to be my next question. Where can people find you? But by the way, your website is very nice because I've been following you lately and I've been following some blog posts. It's really nice. It's really cool. So keep up the good work. And yeah, all the best. And thank you very much for being part of the WPCC and contributing as well. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris. And yeah, hopefully we'll have you again to ask you more questions.
I'm always available.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Yep.
Bye-bye.